All right, cool. So welcome, all of you. There's so many people here, I'm not really sure what to do with myself. Oh, here's some new people coming in. Sandra, have a seat. Persia, do we have
More?
these to hand out?
Brody, what up, man? Hey, Solo.
You are, yeah. It's okay. You don't have to. You don't have to take it off.
One year to yell at me.
All right, so does everybody have a copy of the post-possession and the pre-possession addendums?
Yes.
All right, I think Persia has some over there if you don't have enough. Beta, can you hear me okay? All's well? Okay. So let me ask a question. Why do we have these? Like, what is a pre-possession addendum for? Why would we use this?
In case buyer wanted to move in before closing of the escrow,
Okay.
we need to use the pre-possession.
So specifically for a buyer that wants to occupy a property prior to the close of escrow. So pre-possession. Does that make sense? Pretty simple. It's the only time you'd ever use it. There's no other there's no other reason to use it. There's only the buyer is going to be occupying, and it's going to be prior to the close of escrow. Tell me, is it a good idea to use it?
No,
So we have one no, don't like to use it. Okay? Anybody else have an opinion? Don't know, don't care?
Well, I'm sure if we have the form, it's necessary, but there's other ways of doing it. Wouldn't you just up the close of escrow to close sooner?
Well, you could move the close of escrow sooner, but maybe the lender hasn't had enough time yet to get it done. I mean, I've actually seen them where it goes under contract and the property's vacant, and then the seller or the buyer reaches out and says, hey, we don't have anywhere to live for the next 30 days while our lender gets the loan done, and can we occupy the property until the loan gets done? So, I mean, I've had people move in 2 and 3 weeks prior to the close of escrow, which just takes a little bit longer to get the loan done. Or back when I actually seen this get used a few times back when the pandemic hit. And what happened when the pandemic hit that many people don't know about if you weren't in the middle of a transaction is the lenders have to get from the IRS your tax transcripts. And so when the pandemic hit and all of the IRS went home and they were no longer working on a day-to-day basis, it was virtually impossible for about 3 months to actually get anything from the IRS. So it stopped deals from happening. It stopped, people couldn't qualify, they couldn't get their loan done in time. And so I seen them use these post or pre-possession addendums at that time. So pre-possession is sometimes necessary. What I would tell you and what I would have you advise your client is to avoid it at any cost, because the possible challenges that happen after somebody occupies a property can far outweigh the advantage of having them move in. Okay, so if you're on the listing side of this whole thing, then you've got to look at this from one perspective. And if you're on the buy side, of course, you want your buyers to be able to have a place to live, and you got to get them in, and you're pushing and pushing. But the reality is depending on what side of the transaction you're on, just really makes a difference on the perspective of, okay, does this make sense for my client? On the buy side, it makes total sense. Why? Because there's really no downside to it. You get to move in early, you have a place to stay, you pay your rent or whatever's collected for that period of time, and it is what it is. The one downside could be that you don't qualify for your loan for some reason. Has anybody ever had a buyer that suddenly didn't qualify on the last day? Or 2 days before closing, or 3 days before closing? Like, you hear all the time those stories where they went out and bought new furniture. They financed new furniture for their new home the week before or the day before, and when the lender pulled the credit report the next day, now their debt to income ratio is out of ratio and they can no longer qualify to buy.
Especially in the pandemic, many people are losing their job just 1 day or 2 days, or they're furloughed
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, we seen that a ton, right? Like I know when the pandemic hit in, was it March, I think? My team had 9 deals that were gonna close over the next 30 days, and 6 of them fell out that day. Like people got laid off from work and they no longer had jobs, and they couldn't qualify, right? So prepossession can cause some problems, right? So what are some of the problems it can cause? Just before we go through the addendum, I just like share some, anybody have any experience with a prepossession and something that went sideways?
I don't have the experience, but I can guess. So if they cannot close for any reason, then going through the eviction process.
Okay, so that's the ultimate problem, right? That's the biggest problem. If for some reason the buyer then can't close the loan, how do we get them out? They're in possession of the property. They're legally there. They have a contract, right? The contract is this addendum that said that they could occupy. So now tenancy law probably has some effect. I don't know if it has 100% effect because I'm not an attorney, but I mean, yeah, so you got to probably go through the eviction process. As Christian just pointed out, during the pandemic, how long has it been? 13, 14, 15 months now? Right? So for 15 months, you couldn't evict anybody. So now you got someone who's literally living there for free. That's the ultimate challenge, right? That's the biggest possible dilemma. How about some other inconvenient dilemmas, like they live in the house and now suddenly the air conditioner stops working? And the seller says, well, you're living there, you're possessing the property, you're using, that's your responsibility to fix the air conditioner. And the buyer goes, no, wait a minute, I don't own this home. It's your responsibility, right? Well, if there was a lease in place, the lease would dictate whose responsibility is. But unfortunately, the prepossession doesn't, right? So now this becomes a contention, an argument between agents, between buyers and sellers. What if, suddenly the pool turns green and the seller goes, well, yeah, I canceled my service because you live there and you need to maintain it. And they're like, no, we don't own the property. We're just living here. You have to do it, right? So there's even those simple little problems that take up a tremendous amount of people's time, not just our time as agents, but as homeowners and buyers, lenders, right? Deals are on, deals are off, tempers flare, people get mad, right? So the lender stops working on it, and then a week later, everyone's calmed down, and now they got to work on it again, and now they don't have enough time to close it. Like, there's just a lot of problems that could happen. There are the right times to use it, so that's why this addendum exists. Good point, Christian. So, as you look, I've supplied everybody with what the addendum looks like, pre-possession. Any questions specifically about the addendum itself? Like the very beginning is very self-explanatory. Buyers, sellers' names, the date that the RPA was executed. That's pretty standard on any addendum that we have. The address for the premises, and then it's saying that the buyer and/or the seller hereby proposes. So the buyer is asking for prepossession typically, so it's usually going to be the buyer that proposes this. But also look at it like this. The buyer could propose it, they could send over this prepossession addendum, the seller could reject it, and then send another one back that says, here's what we propose. So that's why there's a buyer and a seller checkbox. That seems to always be a question people ask me is, why is there a seller checkbox if this is a buyer is the one that's going to be filling this out? Well, the buyer, just like a counteroffer, right? The seller could say, or an addendum that you write for anything else. I don't agree with that, but here, let me write a new addendum that says this is what I would agree to and see if you'll sign that. Make sense? All right, so number one is just the date. That is the date that they're allowed to begin possessing the property. What is number two? So number two is a little more detailed, right? So A is they accept the premise in the current condition except as follows. What would be some things that you think would go in the except as follows? So the buyer's moving in, they're accepting it like it is, except for what?
Requested repairs.
Okay, maybe they still want to reserve their right for a request for repairs. And or maybe they've already done that and they want to make sure that those repairs are still going to be completed. What else? What other conditions? How about the pool? The condition is the seller needs to continue pool maintenance. The seller needs to continue the lawn maintenance. Now, those are conditions. Those are things that we need to make sure that both buyer and seller are in an agreement on. So sometimes you got to think a little bit past just the, what would appear to be the condition of a property. It doesn't necessarily reference the condition of the property, but condition in this case could be a condition or the condition of the property. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions? B just talks about how much money they're going to make. Seller's going to get paid a compensation for the premises for the sum of blank, and then you get to write out the number, which is the number per day. This is always a. So let me ask this question. I got a $3,000. I'm going to pay him $3,000 for my pre-possession. It's for 30 days. What's the price per day?
$30, right?
$100.
$3,000, and I'm going to be there for 30 days. It's $100 a day. Okay? So I'm going to be paying them $100 a day to be there. Better be a really nice property, but at the same time, the math was easy that way. What I want you to understand, and a lot of people miss this in real estate, they don't remember this, everything in real estate is calculated on a 30-day calendar. So if the month happens to have 31 days, it happens to have 31 days, everything's calculated on a 30-day year or month. So it's always divided by 30, whatever that is. So whatever the rent they're paying is, it's divided by 30. That's what goes in your per day in the parentheses there, right? And then if there's going to be a deposit, buyer shall pay a security deposit in the amount of, and then what's the to mean? Yeah, so they're going to pay security deposit in the amount of, that's where the dollar sign is. And then it says to, T-O, and then there's a blank line. Oh.
Escrow or the seller.
Okay, so it's somebody, right? And that's, so what that's asking is who's going to get the security deposit? Buyer's going to give $1,000 security deposit, but who gets it? Goes right to the seller? Does it go to escrow? Maybe it goes to escrow and gets credited towards the purchase of the property. What's the best way to handle that? Let's talk about that for a minute. The seller goes, oh no, I'd like you to write the security deposit check directly to me. Is that a good way to do it? Maybe not. Maybe it is. Maybe that's what makes sense. Not saying you couldn't do that. What's a smarter way to do it?
Another question, is it binding in it as a tenant landlord?
It could be. I'm not an attorney. So the question for the camera is this a binding is this binding enough that it introduces into our scenario tenant law, right? Is that your question? And so
Usually landlord keep the security deposit.
correct. And so my answer is I don't know, because I'm not an attorney. My gut feeling says that it probably does interject some of the tenant laws, but what does it interject? I don't know. But let's also agree though, this has to be an agreement between buyer and seller before it introduces anything. And so what's the best way to, if they're going to give a security deposit, what's the best way to give it?
Still, for me, it's better to give it to the seller because in case some damages happen, then they need authorization from both sides to the escrow to release it to the seller. So it is making it more complicated. So if it's a security deposit, I would rather to give it to the seller in case of whatever is happening.
All right, so Medi wants to give it to the seller. That way they can handle it like any other lease that would be if there was some kind of damage or something, the seller would have possession of that. Pretty good protection for the seller. What about is that a good protection for the buyer?
If the deal is not closed, then
Yeah. Can't get the money back, right? And or there's not even an accounting of the money. If it went directly to the seller, could it be counted towards the money that the buyer had given to cover their closing costs on the deal? See, I'm looking at this from the buy side, and if I was going to do it, I would want to deposit the security deposit as an additional earnest money deposit, right, into escrow, and then I would do an addendum that would release that to the seller. So now the seller has the money, That's good protection for the seller. But this way, at least that $1,000 gets credited towards my purchase, right? I don't have to come up with an additional $1,000 when it's time to actually close the deal down. All right, so the two, after the two means that's who's going to get the money. It's going to be to escrow. It's going to be to escrow to be released with addendum number 1 to seller with addendum number 1 attached, something like that. I know that's a very short line there, but you can write as much information as you need on that line to make sure that everybody understands where the money's going to go. To pay compensation in advance to be prorated as the date of closing to seller at the following address. So this is, if it's going to go to the seller, this is just the address that the seller wants the money sent to. Right, very simple. Just this is where you mail me the money, basically. All right, any questions? I mean, this talks about the utilities, who's going to pay what, when is it going to be prorated, to maintain the subject property, the current condition including heating, sewer, plumbing, electrical, any built-in appliances and equipment in normal working order. So this is saying that someone's going to maintain that, right? Who's going to maintain the subject property in this case?
Buyer.
Should be the buyer, but I think that it has to address, right? As you said at the beginning.
Okay, so let's refer back to the top of number 2, and it says, in consideration of seller's permission to buyer to take possession of the premises prior to the close of escrow, buyer agrees to the following.
The A, it is what? Who?
A, B, C, D. So D is to pay all utilities and services on a prorated basis. And E is to maintain the subject property, including heating, sewer, plumbing, electrical systems, built-in appliances. So the buyer's agreeing on this to cover that, right? To be responsible for all of that stuff. To not make any alterations to the premises. So they can't go in and start knocking down walls, repainting, changing out countertops, doing it. They can't do anything. It's got to stay in the same condition it was in when they took the property. To abide by all laws and government regulations. So you can't turn it into a grow house. You can't sell drugs out of it. You can't, I don't know. Is this appropriate? You can't run a prostitution ring out of your house. I don't know. You can't do any of that stuff, right? You're taking possession. You got to follow the law based on what's there. Buyer, upon 24-hour notice, shall admit seller. So this gives the seller the ability, or the seller's representative, with a 24-hour notice, which, Mehdi, as you pointed out, does this introduce tenant law? Well, that's something that comes right from tenant law, that 24-hour notice. The seller gives notice of wanting to come in the property, they give a 24-hour notice, and the buyer has to allow them into the property. So there's a little bit of that mixed in there. Buyer agrees to hold seller and the agent and/or agents in the transaction harmless for any claims or damages or injuries to the seller or any person or to any property or the results of this addendum. Phew, that's a lot. So that's basically an overall release, right? So that brings up another question, though. What about insurance?
I was just gonna say something. What if there's a fire? Like this happened with my aunt, the dishwasher, caught fire.
According to this, it's up to the buyer to maintain the dishwasher.
Okay, but then it says the seller shall maintain a policy of fire and extended coverage.
Oh, did I miss one? Sorry.
That's on the bottom, that's number 3.
Oh, we're not there
So
yet.
what if there's a fire on the house and all of a sudden the buyer said, I don't wanna buy it now.
Well, okay, that's a good question. But before we get there, let's get to, this one's talking about holding everybody harmless if something happens on the property. I fall down and break my leg, right? Who am I going to sue because I did that? Does anybody know? Do I sue the buyer or do I sue the seller? The seller?
Buyer.
Okay, I sue the buyer? You guys see the problem here? Like, everybody has a different opinion, so you have to understand. So ultimately, I believe an attorney's going to tell you would sue the seller because the seller still owns the premises. But this is saying the buyer is going to hold everybody harmless, which now the seller is going to turn around and say, well, okay, but you're responsible, so you're holding me harmless. You've got to go to court for me, right?
I have a question. If it was a tenant-landlord situation, who was responsible, landlord or the tenant?
It would be the insurance that's on the property. So that's where I'm trying to get to is if you ever let somebody have post-possession of a property, I highly recommend that you have them get renter's insurance. Even if it's just for a week, it's going to cost pennies. But have them call up their insurance guy. Whatever insurance guy is going to do the insurance on the property when they purchase it, they need to write a renter's policy for the property because then we're covered. Then the buyer and the seller are covered. Everyone's covered based on having the right insurances in place. So does that make sense? Right. So it doesn't say here that you have to do that. I would just tell you that that's something you should be thinking about as an agent. All right. So so number 3, maintain a policy of fire and extended coverage of the premises until the same is conveyed to the buyer. Buyer shall be responsible for repair and replacement of all damages to the premises after taking possession. No such damage shall relieve buyer of any obligation under this agreement of sale. So that answers your question. If the house burns down, this does not, the fact that it burned down does not relieve them from the responsibility of purchasing the property. Now, if they're still within their loan contingency, they can't get a loan on a burnt down house, and so now they can cancel based on the contract. If they're still within their appraisal contingency, they can't. Right, and then I believe, I can't think of where it is in the RPA now, but I believe there's somewhere in the RPA that also addresses a fire, that if at any time prior to the close of escrow there's a fire, it's addressed in there. So I can't quote that, but I'm pretty sure that that's in there. All right, so any questions on the prepossession? There's something on the back of the page, turn it over. So it's a 2-page document, by the way. Number 4, in the event the premises to create a tenancy upon a day-to-day basis, pending completion of the sale of the premises, either party shall have the right to terminate the tenancy within 7 days. So everybody still has a right to cancel this prepossession. If it's going sideways, so let's real quick. So I let them move in 2 weeks early because we had to wait for the IRS to get their transcripts in. So they're going to qualify. It's no big deal. And 2 weeks after that, the IRS still hasn't delivered. And 2 weeks after that, the IRS still hasn't delivered. Now we're a month down the road. Now we're a month and a half down the road. This still gives the seller the ability to get them out of the property if for some reason they can't perform, whatever that reason might be. Okay, so. And then on the line there, that's just going to be the address that you're going to deliver if the buyer wants to get out. That's the address that the buyer would deliver the notice to. Buyer agrees to pay all costs incurring in the legal action instituted by seller to enforce the terms of the addendum or for the removal of the buyer of the premises, including reasonable attorney's fees. So I think that covers a little more of your tenancy law. It's the buyer's responsibility. If they take possession of the property, they're going to be responsible ultimately for attorney's fees, reasonable attorney's fees. I don't know what reasonable means, but attorneys know what that means, so it's okay. It's the intent of the parties that the addendum is a condition of the sale of subject property and is not intended to be a rental agreement as defined in NRS 118A. So that now knocks all tenancy law out of the agreement, right? So what I say, it depends. I don't know. We got to talk to an attorney. There's lots of stuff in here that sounds like tenancy law, and then there's that last thing that just says this is not tenancy law. All right, so that's prepossession. There are companies in town. This is not, and that's not Signature, but there are companies, not just in town, but throughout the entire country, who 100% never allow prepossession. Never. Now, let me ask you this question. It's Friday afternoon, and you find out that the house is not going to record on Friday because of some really dumb thing. I don't know what it is, but it's something that make like everyone looks at it and goes, that doesn't even make sense, but the lender won't fund because of this thing, whatever it is. Something came on the credit report that nobody agrees to, whatever that looks like, right? It's Friday afternoon. We're definitely going to get this thing resolved on Monday, and so it's going to close on Monday. We just got to wait the weekend, okay? But the buyer says, well, wait a minute. I moved out of my house on Thursday knowing I was going to be able to move into mine on Friday. All my stuff is in the U-Haul truck, and I'm staying at my Aunt Betty's house, who's driving me absolutely crazy, I got to get out, right? So we could do a pre-possession addendum, right? Does that make sense? And the seller says, no pre-possession, not going to do it. And then the buyer says, well, wait a minute, I got to unload my stuff. I can't leave it in the U-Haul truck because I got to get the truck back. It's costing me money. Could I put all of my stuff in the garage?
Possession.
What's that?
Is it still possession?
Well, is it possession? I'm not going to be staying there. I'm not going to be living there. Just my stuff is going to be there. Is it possession or not possession?
Possession.
Do I need a pre-possession addendum to put my stuff in the garage?
I would say yes.
Okay, good. Resounding yes. Yes, you still need that. Even if you're just putting your stuff in the garage over the weekend and you're not going to be living there, your stuff is there. The reason why you need that is not because you're possessing the property, but because your stuff is there. And if it gets stolen or caught on fire or whatever, there's some kind of insurance coverage for that. Make sense? Okay, any questions about pre-possession? Don't do it. Well, please, you can. Let's be clear. You can do it. It's available. It's a tool that you can use in your business. And yes, I would always tell you don't do it, but sometimes there's just, by the way, let me be clear. On my team, we don't close homes on Fridays. We do not ever have a closing that's scheduled for a Friday, ever. That's why right there. Because that stupid thing that holds it up over the weekend, we could resolve on Friday morning and they can still move in on the weekend. Buyers move out of their homes, they take work off for the weekend, like they clear their schedule. They have mom and dad fly in from Chicago and the cousins drive down from Utah, like everyone's here ready to go. And oh, by the way, all we can do is party at the pool because I can't move into my new house, right? We never close on a Friday for that reason. It's always a Thursday, and we can solve them problems on Friday and still be able to move in over the weekend. So maybe add that to your business plan. Look at your calendar when you put a close date. Make sure it's not a Friday. The last Friday of the month is the worst, absolute worst day to close on because there's all of those little things crop up on those days because that's when escrow's the busiest. That's when the lender's the busiest. That's when your loan officer's got 37 agents calling them wanting to know what's going on, right? It's just a rough day. It's a rough week, actually, that whole.
Story.
Yeah, so Myra's had that happen.
And yeah, it's always the craziest, not only lender-wise, but title as well.
Yeah.
It's like, we already know, month end is a horrible day.
Yeah, pre-quals on month end are tough, right? You got to do them, but
It just happened until the following week.
Yeah, it doesn't happen too often as far as rolling over. If it's gonna roll over, we typically know in advance, but, it happens.
yeah. So I mean, our job is to make this as painful for our clients as possible, right? I mean, that's our job. So do your job and don't schedule a closing on Fridays and don't schedule them for the last day of Friday. Now, there's advantages to closing on the last day of the month for a buyer. Less prorations, no interest paid. The money out of pocket is less. All of that stuff, I get that. But at the same time, that not being able to move in over the weekend is also a very uncomfortable conversation to have with a client that, the last thing we want your client to remember is how great you were and not how that last one little thing caused a bit of a problem. All right, pre-possession. Do it if you want, be warned. It's tough. All right, what about post-possession?
And the other seller wants to stay after
There's
Okay.
a contingency and they're waiting for their house to sell so they can clear from the next one. And
Okay.
maybe there's a gap of a couple weeks or something.
Are we, so for the camera, I don't know, okay, Beta, can you hear when these guys talk?
Yeah.
You can hear them? I don't need to repeat it?
Yeah, you can if you want.
Okay, I'll repeat it. So what was said was that, post-possession is used when a seller needs to stay in a property after close of escrow. The example given was maybe they're waiting for their new house to get ready to close. They need the money from this sale to be able to buy the next house. And so they stay for a week or two or a few days or a month or 45 days or 60 days, right? It just depends. I actually have one in contract right now. Close of escrow, I think, is the 19th of May, April, May, yeah. and we have a 60-day lease back for the seller. Like, my seller is super, super cautious. We've had hours upon hours of conversation about listing the home and selling the home, and what if this happens, what if that happens, all the way down to what if we get a warning that an asteroid's going to hit the earth. And I mean, literally, we've had those kind of conversations, and she's super worried about finding a new property to move into, which makes sense in this market, right? I mean, there's not a lot of inventory, people are paying just crazy amounts of money for things, and so she's concerned. So we have a 60-day lease back, right? So we have to use a post-possession addendum for that, yes.
If the buyer is a finances, that is the maximum, right?
That is the maximum. We are up against the maximum number, yes. So the point was that if the buyer's getting financed, if it's FHA or VA, Myra, does it apply to conventional? I don't think it does. Oh, it does. So,
Yeah, if it's primary residence, it does.
okay, so VA, FHA, conventional, primary residency, they've got to occupy the property within 60 days. So on the 61st day, they have to live there, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is occupancy? Does that mean I have to have a utility bill in my name?
Technically.
Or does it mean I have to physically live in the property?
I mean, I think technically it means you have to live in the property. I don't think that they have somebody, Oregon, but, I don't think they have somebody watching you right outside the.
The occupancy police are not roving the neighborhood?
Those people, it's like a serious job where if they see that possibly you cannot be occupying the property, they will actually have people sit out in cars watching to see who goes in and out of that home, to see if you have mail coming in.
Wow.
So it's an actual job.
To make sure it's not a rental.
Yeah, to make sure that people are not lying.
Yeah, so it's loan fraud if you don't do it, right? Nobody wants to commit loan fraud. By the way, that's federal. That's the big house, not the little house. So stay away from that. That's not a good thing. All right.
Obviously, you want to have a post-possession so someone buys the property, you rent back instead of having a long escrow.
Yeah, well, again, the example given was that I can't even buy my next house until this house closes. So it has to close, it has to record, money has to be sent to my bank account, so then I can then use that money to purchase my new home with. So yeah, that's happening. This is, by the way, this is what caused this class, was because this is happening on, I would say, at least 30% of the transactions right now. There's some type of post-possession involved. So now the question is, how long of a post-possession is acceptable and still use this addendum?
Anywhere from 1 to 60 days.
Okay, so up to 60 days maybe? Okay. Nobody else has an opinion?
I mean, even for one day, you need that.
Yeah, it just covers everyone.
Yeah, for one day, but what's the longest we could go and still use the post-possession addendum?
60.
If it's not financing, is that what you mean?
Don't matter if it's not financing. Yeah, I mean, could you, well, let's say it's not financing. Let's say it's a cash deal. How long could we use this addendum for post-possession?
I would guess less than a year.
I would
Okay.
say we go for the lease agreement if it takes long, because there are more wars out to protect the seller or buyer.
So you're saying how long? I'll need a date. Is it a 30-day? Is it 60, 90, a year? We have a year, less than a year.
Less than a year.
So 364 days,
A year and 1 day.
366 days. 30 days, 90 days? We have a 60 days here.
Yeah,
I feel like this is an auction.
60 days, I think.
Highest bidder right here.
Well, you're 60.
Do I hear 90 days? Is anybody going to get, can I get 90 days? All right, so there's no rule. There's no right or wrong, but what I will tell you is if you get into a situation that's more than 30 days, you need to go talk to your broker, because there's a lot of things that can happen in a 60-day post-possession, and there's absolutely no reason you'd ever use it for 90 or a year. That's not what it's intended for. This is a short-term, a week, 2 weeks, 30 days at the most, 60 days maybe, right? Like we used it on our 60-day one, but it could be a challenge.
What happens if there is a tenant occupying the property for, like, let's say, 8 more months, you can't kick him out.
Okay, so
They have a lease.
in that case, they have a lease in place. And in the law is that if there's a valid lease in place and ownership of the property changes, the new owner must honor the lease that's in place. So that's not post-possession, that's a tenant with tenant rules with a lease in place. So, yeah, good question though. That's a good valid point, because that's happening a lot right now too, with tenants in place. Even if they're not paying, they're still tenants. They still get to stay, they still get to live by those rules.
Well, I have one without a lease, and we cannot get her out.
Right, because
CDC.
they're, well,
The moratorium's protecting her.
yeah, she's
It's
not,
expired in December, we still can't get her out.
well, because she's not paying her rent, right?
She's not paying her rent.
Yeah, because you can evict for non-payment.
Yeah.
You could evict for,
Methamphetamine, but she's not doing that.
I know a guy, call me, I'll, I can help you, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so there's lots of rules there, right? So post-possession, I would tell you, general rule of thumb, 30 days. If you're going past 30 days, you should think very hard about just doing a lease agreement. You should just put a quick lease agreement together and have both parties agree and sign that. It covers everybody in a much better way. Not just the buyer and the seller, but both agents, both brokerages. It's just a better idea. Have I used it past 30 days? Yeah, I just told you. I've got one currently that we're going to do for up to 60 days. Now, we feel like she'll be under contract. I don't think it's going to go past 30 days because the seller is now paying cash for the new property. We're going to close that thing in 10 days, so I don't think we're going to get to the 60 days. But general rule of thumb, 30 days, it's pretty comfortable. Anything after 30 days, talk to your broker.
I saw too many times there was a tenant in, and it was mentioned that lease buy is available. Who is responsible to pay a broker because it is
Wait, say it again. There's a tenant in place.
tenant in place, so, but the lease is overlapping the close of the escrow.
Okay, so the lease overlaps close of escrow.
So, but the seller and the agent, listing agent is mentioning the lease buy is available. So you can pay the tenant to move out early.
Okay, so you could do a lease buyout.
Yes.
Okay.
So who, we are paying to still as a buyer's side, we are paying to the escrow, and landlord is responsible to talk to them. Who is responsible? How we know?
Okay, so if there's a lease in place, who is that lease between?
Between landlord, the seller, and the tenant.
Okay, so the landlord or seller and the tenant. So the only person who can talk to the tenant about the lease that they're in a lease with is the seller.
Yeah.
As a buyer's agent, as the buyer, as a listing agent, you have to stay out of those conversations because you don't have any agency. You've never, that person's not your client.
No, I understand that, but I'm thinking about the payment. So I, as a buyer agent.
It all has to be arranged through the seller. You could pay it through close of escrow. So like you could agree to pay it through close of escrow, and then the tenant would have to vacate the property, and then when the property closed, they could get their money through close of escrow. The escrow company could pay them directly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You could also give the seller, the buyer could give the seller a cashier's check. Like I would have the seller, I'd have the buyer give me the cashier's check. I'd make a photocopy of it and send it to the listing agent so they can see I have it. And then when it closed, we could exchange that check. Because that's not anything to do with a loan. That's buying out the lease. So that's not, you can't do that in a loan, you know, if you're buying, anyway. I never should have got into that. Sorry about that. That's not anything we want to talk about. But it could go through escrow, or the seller, the buyer could pay the seller directly. Seller could pay the buyer, and then he could get reimbursed through close of escrow. There's 100 ways that you can handle that. Okay? All right, so post-possession. Again, let me say one more time. Up to 30 days, I'm comfortable. After 30 days, I want you to talk to your broker because there's just a lot of things that need to be discussed between both parties to make sure that everybody's covered. All right. Any questions specific? I mean, the post-possession is essentially the same as the pre-possession. All of the same information is required. A lot of people get tripped up on number 2B because they want to know what the per month, the dollars per month, and then the dollars per day. The daily rent for the purpose of proration shall be, that's the last part of number B there. So again, it's however much money they're going to pay for the post-possession, right? Now here's the challenge. If you've got a 10-day post-possession and the month is always calculated on 30 days, what's the per day price? Is it divided by 10 or is it divided by 30?
Divided by 30, multiplied by 10.
Divided by 30, multiplied by 10.
All right, none of you passed math in school, I can tell. Like story questions, story problems didn't work. No, I'm just kidding. So if it's less than 30 days, then it's just however, you know exactly it's divided by the number of days. So if it's 10-day post-possession and they're paying $1,000, it's $100 per day. Is that right? Yeah. I really like that $100 per day thing, don't I? That's weird. So that's a little high, but so until it gets past the 30 days, it's just divided by the number of days they'll have possession of the property. Okay? Any questions? Again, this all covers the same stuff. There's no real changes. The wording is all the same, except where everywhere on the pre-possession where it said buyer is responsible for, like look at number 2. In consideration of the buyer, right, before that said seller, permission for the seller, which used to say buyer, to retain possession of the premises after the close of escrow, seller agrees to the following, instead of buyer agrees to the following. So now the seller is agreeing to all of the things A through I. Buyer has to maintain a policy. Now that's different. Number 3 says the buyer has to maintain an insurance policy. Why is that?
Because it's now his place.
Because they're now the owner of the property, right? And no one's going to give a loan on the property if there isn't insurance anyway. So the only time you really have to question this is if it's a cash deal. And I think, no, actually I've seen where they've closed without insurance in place. So, in fact, my mother did it on a cabin once. She paid cash, closed on it, and like a year later I said, who do you have your insurance through? She went, we don't have any insurance. I didn't buy any. I'm like, oh my gosh, let's fix that. Cabin burns down, we're done, right? Yeah, so.
In California?
No, it's in Utah. But so everything is the same from pre-possession to post-possession, except people change roles, right? Now we're talking about the seller agreeing to all of these things. Now the buyer has to have an insurance policy in place. Let me ask you this. Seller staying in the property for 21 days after close of escrow. Do they need a renter's policy?
Say
They're staying in the property with the post-possession for 21 days. Do they need to get a renter's policy?
Yes, because they're not covered.
yeah,
How are they
yeah,
covered?
I would say
Only
yes.
if they want to.
The company?
It's their choice, right?
It's their choice, and our suggestion to them is,
As a buyer agent,
you need to get one.
Insurance agent, we're not insurance agent.
Please get one. No, please get one. I can't give it to you because I'm not an insurance agent, but please get an insurance policy. Please get a renter's. Guys, renter's insurance policies are like $25 a month. So if they're doing it for 21 days, what's it going to be, like $18? Like, get it done through escrow so that it's all done, ready to go. Get it done with the guy that's doing the insurance on the house when if the new buyer's coming in and they're using State Farm, just do it through State Farm. That way it's all insured at the same place. And if there was a problem, doesn't really matter. They're not going to fight between insurance companies. It's just going to get handled, right? So opposite here applies. If they're possessing after close of escrow, I suggest they get an insurance policy, renter's insurance policy, and I like to use the same company that the buyer is buying their homeowner's policy from. Make sense? All right, questions?
I wasn't a deal with the post-position. We didn't use the addendum. We make it as an additional term of RPA.
Okay. So how did you do that?
Sorry?
How did you do that? Like, did you go back and rewrite the RPA?
No, when we send the offer, they counter us back.
Okay.
Put it as a for of how long they are staying and how much they are going to pay and those things as an additional term.
So the buyer and the seller negotiated the terms of the rent back or the post-possession in the counteroffer,
Yes,
and both buyer and seller agreed to that.
yes.
Good.
So is it sufficient to replace it?
Well, let me ask you, what challenge do you see with that?
This, at least item number 5, that is saying is not the tenant buyer lease agreement. In
Okay.
that case, it doesn't mention this one, that is one.
Well, what about A through I?
Yeah, there are too many things, but the most important part for me is that one, especially.
So everybody only ever thinks about the money. Oh, how much is it going to cost and how much time could we get? I mean, that's always the conversation, right? But the reality is, as a professional, as a real estate agent, we've got to be concerned with A through I. So even if it was negotiated in the terms, I would then go get a post-possession addendum, and I would put the terms in this addendum, and I'd get both parties to sign it. In fact, I would counter back with, and we do this often, post-possession addendum to be agreed upon and signed by both parties during due diligence period, or both parties have the right to cancel. Right? I mean, the buy side always has a right to cancel during due diligence, but I'm giving my seller, if they can't get agreement on a post-possession, the right to cancel. And by the way, there's nowhere in the RPA that the seller has a right to cancel, right? Nowhere. The only time they can cancel is if the buyer doesn't close on the close of escrow date. So here, I'm at least giving the seller the opportunity, if they can't get a post-possession agreement in place, to cancel. Because if you're on the buy side of this thing and you want $1,000 a month and the seller's like, no, I'll give you $750, and you can't agree, guess who wins? The buyer. That just means that you're moving out of the property on the close of escrow date as a seller. Now you could be in a really bad spot, right? So understand that you need to protect your seller by giving them the right to cancel if they can't get a post-possession addendum signed during the due diligence period. Does that make sense? So they can then cancel. Beta, do we have a question?
Yes. Must be cash buyer in order to lease more than 60 days, question mark?
Yeah, so back to that, yeah. So we said FHA, VA, or conventional owner occupied, because you can do an FHA loan on an investment property. It's just 20% down instead of 3.5. Myra's going, hell no, you're crazy.
FHA has to be primary residence.
Okay. You could,
VA has to be primary residence. Conventional, you have the option to do primary or investment.
Okay. So if your loan was done and you told your loan officer this is an investment property, then the 60 days doesn't apply. But if it's owner occupied, then yes, only 60 days. And of course, cash can be as long as they want because they don't have to follow any rules. I hope that answers the question. All right, any questions? There's one other thing that's additional on the post-possession that is not on the pre-possession. Oh, it is there. I'm sorry, I missed it. So number 6, additional terms. Like which one of you attorneys out there, wannabe attorney real estate agents, can come up with some fantastic additional terms for us? Like what would be some of the additional terms in the post-possession? Persia, stop whistling at me.
Maybe having it cleaned before.
Okay, having the property cleaned prior to leaving. Okay, what else? Remember the pool? Right, I mean, maybe the additional term is that the occupant continue to pay for pool service, because here's what happens. I know you're saying, well, it says on the front in one of the A through I's that they have to maintain the property. I know it says that. But when the buyer bought the property, it was being maintained by Laguna Pools. And now they're only going to be there for 21 more days. So they say, hey, you don't need to come for the next 3 weeks. I'll take care of it. I'll do it. Like I'm responsible, I'm maintaining it. And the care goes substantially down. It's no longer crystal clear. It's murky at best, right? So the additional term could be seller must continue to use pool company to maintain the pool. Company must continue to use landscaper to do lawn maintenance. Oh, I'll mow it just before I leave. Okay, yeah, well, what about trimming the plants and pulling the weeds and the fertilizing and all the other stuff? So those are some of your additional terms that could be a part of a pre-possession and or even a post-possession addendum. Christian, did you have something?
No.
Okay. All right, any questions about pre-possession, post-possession? I think post-possession is just as treacherous as a pre-possession, just so you know. Here's what we're seeing a lot of right now. I've literally had this 4 times in the last 60 days. Somebody, an agent, will have a client that does a post-possession. And then the new buyer comes and does their final walkthrough before close of escrow. And then they come and do a walkthrough after the owner vacates, and they won't release any of the security deposit or any of the money that was left in escrow because the property wasn't professionally cleaned. Although on the post-possession, they didn't say that they needed to get it professionally cleaned. So this is becoming a challenge because, as you've pointed out, does tenancy law come into play here? And the buyer comes in thinking, yeah, it does. I want my house professionally cleaned since I let you live there for 3 or 4 weeks or a month or whatever that looks like. Understand that the RPA dictates even though there's a post-possession addendum. Now, if you write something in addition to what's in the residential purchase agreement on here, this would then take over. If that makes sense. What does the RPA say about how the property must be left?
The same way as the day that they shoot the property.
Okay, and how about cleanliness? It's very clear. It says something, property must be left in broom swept condition. That's what it says. It doesn't say you have to hire Annie the maid to come in and clean it. It doesn't say that you've got to mop the floors. It doesn't say that you've got to wash all the walls and clean out all the cabinets. Now, it does say you can't leave any debris, so you can't leave stuff in the drawers, but it's just broom swept condition. And for whatever reason, when this post-possession gets put into place, buyers start to think, who are now the owner, oh, I'm not going to give your money back because you didn't have the house professionally cleaned when you left. Well, where did it say I had to get it professionally? Well, I don't know, but I want it professionally cleaned and I'm not going to sign the addendum. So trust me when I tell you that the post-possession addendum can be just as treacherous as a pre-possession addendum. Maybe 80%. Like the pre-possession for me is super dangerous because, man, you just don't know if they're going to close. There's just too, I mean, every single day there's a new factor, and one of them is the buyer got hit by a bus. You know, I mean, that's a bad thing to say, but that's just reality, right?
Is it wise for both agents just to agree right off the bat that it will be professionally cleaned and they go 50-50?
Sure, it could be in the additional term. No, you could just tell the seller, in order for me, the buyer could say, in order for you to keep possession, one of the additional terms of this agreement is that you'll have it professionally cleaned. And if it was a negotiated upfront thing, every single one of the sellers that I talked to about this said the same thing. We would have had it done, no problem. And 2 of them were really mad because they thought their wives cleaned better than a cleaner would have anyway, but they didn't have a receipt from a cleaning company to give to the buyers. So the buyers wanted a receipt, and they're like, I did a better job than the buyers than a cleaning company would have done anyway. So, right, it's just an argument. That's the problem. So yes, everything that you can think of that is going to be of your buyer's concern, who will then be the owner, and or the seller's concerns, it needs to be in this post-possession addendum.
So in that case, the one that you just mentioned, the example, who keeps the money, the buyer?
What money? Like the security deposit? It's in escrow typically.
Yeah, but so you're saying,
It stays there. If buyer and seller can't agree to release the money, it stays in escrow for 7 years. Escrow takes a little bit of money off every year to maintain the account, and then after 7 years they donate it to there's a fund, state fund, goes to that state fund. So
if they agree on 50/50,
yeah, maybe they agree to 50-50, whatever, but then there's an addendum that gets done that takes care of that. But if you can't agree, one of 2 things happens. It stays there forever, or either the buyer or the seller takes you to small claims court, and then a judge decides, and the judge says who gets the money. So, but nobody wants to go to court. I mean, everyone's out, trust me, everybody, I got to tell you, I've been threatened to be sued, I don't know, 10 times in the last 30 days. Well, I'll just sue you. Go ahead.
What
Like,
have you been doing?
I just mean as the broker, I get those calls, right? Every agent calls who's mad, and the first thing they want to do is sue me. Well, I'll just sue. Okay, go ahead. All that tells me is you've never filed a lawsuit. You don't even know what that takes. So yeah, go ahead, because as soon as you go talk to an attorney, you're probably going to come back and try to get this resolved in a more amicable manner. So yeah, but that is a possibility, for sure. All right, any questions? Beta, any more questions come in from the one viewer that we have? No. All right. Okay, I don't have anything else. Does anybody have any questions about anything that they think we should, like we've got like 4 minutes. I can answer any other real estate related questions. No? All right, cool. Thanks guys, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
In case you need.